There is a lesson that used to live inside the study of human psychology, not buried in a footnote, not hidden in some obscure text that nobody read, taught, discussed, demonstrated in studies that produced results so consistent the researchers themselves called them remarkable. And then quietly it stopped being taught. No announcement was made. No papers were retracted. The studies were not disproven. The principle was simply moved to the edges, crowded out by frameworks that were easier to fund, easier to grade, and far more useful to institutions that needed people to associate earning with effort rather than attunement. Here is what makes that removal strange. The people who continued using that principle kept producing the same results across different industries, different backgrounds, different starting points. Not always dramatically, but consistently, quietly. The way a signal reaches a tuned receiver from 1,000 miles away, while the untuned one beside it picks up nothing but noise. You have been told your financial situation is about discipline, about sacrifice, about compound interest and better habits and waking up earlier. You may have tried all of that. And if those answers had worked completely, you would not be here. What you have not been told is that there is a specific psychological state, documented, measurable, reproducible, that determines whether all of those habits actually move your life forward, or simply keep you busy inside a life that will not change. By the time you finish this, you will know exactly what that state is. You will know why you were never shown how to reach it, and you will know how to recognize the moment you arrive there. Chapter 1. They quietly took this out of the curriculum. Something was removed, not by accident and not all at once. Steadily, quietly, over the course of decades, a particular understanding of the human mind was pulled from the places where minds are formally shaped. Every culture in recorded history has carried some version of this understanding, that a person's inner orientation toward wealth is not a side note to their financial life. It is the source of it. Civilizations built their most enduring wisdom traditions around this idea. They encoded it in different words, in different rituals, in different languages. But the core was the same. Then, somewhere in the early 20th century, a version of this principle began appearing in formal psychological research. It had names. It had data behind it. It was gaining ground in academic circles that were just beginning to take the science of the mind seriously. And then it began disappearing from the mainstream curriculum. You are about to find out what it was, why it was removed, and why the fact that you never learned it in school is the single most expensive thing that ever happened to you. Think about the last time you felt genuinely comfortable talking about money, not complaining about not having enough, not anxiously checking a balance, actually comfortable, relaxed, open, like someone discussing a skill they are steadily building. If you have to reach back further than a few months, you are already feeling the cost of what this chapter is about. There is a question worth sitting with before we go further. If the removal was real, why did no one say anything? Why did the people who discovered this research not fight louder to keep it in the conversation? Hold that question. The answer is coming. And when it arrives, it will reframe everything you thought you understood about why some people seem to build wealth almost naturally, while others work just as hard and stay exactly where they started. In the early decades of formal psychology, researchers were first trying to measure and categorize human behavior. There was a serious, well-funded line of inquiry into what they called expectational states. The idea was this: your nervous system does not respond to reality as it is. It responds to reality as you have been conditioned to anticipate it. Your expectations are not passive predictions. They are active filters. They determine what you notice, what you reach for, what you tolerate, and what you quietly walk away from before anyone else even realizes you have given up. This is not metaphor. This was observable, documentable, measurable behavior. Researchers in that era found that subjects who held strong positive expectations around a particular outcome, employment, financial negotiation, even something as basic as asking for a raise, showed different physiological profiles, different cortisol patterns, different eye movement, different patterns of social approach and engagement. They were not just thinking differently. They were moving through the world differently in ways that produced tangibly different results. The results fed back into the expectations. The expectations fed forward into the next set of results. A loop, a measurable cycle of attunement that, once established, was remarkably self-sustaining. Here is what makes this important for you specifically. The researchers doing this work were not fringe thinkers. They were operating inside credible institutions. They were publishing. They were being cited. And the implications of their findings were significant enough to attract attention from people whose interests lay elsewhere. Let me tell you about a man named Raymond. Raymond grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Ohio in the 1940s. His father worked a factory floor. His mother cleaned houses on weekends. Raymond was sharp, and he earned his way into a small state university on scholarship money and odd jobs. He took his first psychology course in 1961. His professor, an older man who had been publishing since the 1930s, handed the class a reading that Raymond later described as the only thing from his entire education he felt he actually needed. The reading outlined what the professor called the attunement principle: simple on the surface, complex underneath. It argued that the average person absorbs, before the age of 12, a fixed emotional vocabulary around money. That vocabulary is not made up of words. It is made up of physical sensations: tightness in the chest, a contraction in the throat, a lowering of the eyes. Those sensations act as a frequency. They send a consistent signal through every financial interaction that person ever has, not a mystical signal, a behavioral one. The way you carry your body when you enter a salary negotiation, the words you accept without pushing back, the opportunities you hesitate on just long enough for someone with a cleaner signal to take them first. Raymond read that paper 3 times. He took notes in the margins. He asked his professor where the rest of the research was, because this one reading felt like the opening page of something much larger. The professor looked at him quietly for a moment. He said the rest of it was harder to find than it used to be. Raymond spent the better part of 2 years trying to follow the citation trail. He found fragments. He found references to studies that seemed to have been published, but did not appear in the indexes where they should have been. He found one researcher's name appearing in footnotes across multiple sources, and then simply stopping, as if the researcher had ceased to exist professionally around 1953. Raymond eventually built a successful financial consulting practice on the fragments he did find. He never got credit for the research he was essentially reconstructing from scraps. But every client he ever took on, he asked the same first question. He did not ask about their income. He did not ask about their debt. He asked them to describe what their body does when they think about earning more money than they currently earn. The answer told him almost everything. That question, "What does your body do?" is the beginning of what was taken out of the curriculum. Now here is the part that requires honesty. The removal did not happen because someone in power sat in a dark room and decided to keep you poor. It happened because the findings were inconvenient in a very specific economic direction. By the mid-20th century, the consumption economy was accelerating. The most profitable psychological framework for a consumption economy is deficit psychology. The idea that you are incomplete, that you lack, that the solution to your lack is external. You buy, you consume, you borrow to consume more. Deficit psychology does not just describe a mental state, it manufactures one. Manufacturing that state required a different framework to be quietly moved to the margins. One built around internal attunement and sufficiency as a starting condition. This is not conspiracy. This is economics. Follow the money and research funding, and you will find that the questions that get studied are the questions whose answers someone finds useful. What got useful was the science of desire and deprivation. What got sidelined was the science of attunement and expectation. You absorbed deficit psychology before you had any words for it. You felt it in the way money was discussed in your home. You felt it in the silence around money in your home, which is worse. You felt it in school, where personal finance was either absent from the curriculum entirely or presented as a series of warnings about what happens to people who do not manage their lack correctly. The hidden curriculum was always this: money is scarce, desire for it is slightly suspect, and your job is to manage your relationship with not having enough, not to develop a genuine capacity to earn more. That framing cost you, quietly, across years, in decisions that felt too small to notice at the time. Pause here for a moment. Return to your financial reality at that earlier moment, not the numbers specifically, the feeling, the orientation. Did you feel like someone moving towards something, or someone managing something already in decline? That feeling, that orientation, is the frequency this book is about. And whether you felt momentum or managed retreat in that moment tells you exactly how much of the removed lesson is still missing from how you move through the world. The good news is this: nothing removed can stay removed forever. The attunement research did not disappear. It scattered. It lived in the practices of certain therapists, certain coaches, certain quiet practitioners who built remarkable financial lives and could not quite explain why in conventional terms. It lived in fragments, in footnotes, in the intuitions of people like Raymond, who felt the shape of something true without having the full map. This book is the map. Not a map of motivation, not a map of habits, tactics, or financial instruments. A map of the internal frequency that determines which habits you can sustain, which tactics you can execute with confidence, and which financial instruments you will actually reach for versus admire from a careful distance. Soon, you will hear a point about willpower and financial discipline that clashes with the familiar story. After that clicks, it shifts how you act every single day. But before any of that can reach you, you need to understand what was removed and why the removal was so effective. The most sophisticated act of misdirection is the one that makes you believe the absence is natural. You were supposed to feel incomplete around money. The feeling was not an accident. It was a curriculum, one you absorbed without choosing it. The question this chapter ends with is the question this whole book answers. What would your financial life look like if the curriculum had been different? Chapter 2. Why you feel guilty wanting wealth. Every person who wants more money carries the same quiet weight. They want better. They want security, comfort, real options in life. And underneath that wanting, almost without exception, sits a feeling they cannot fully name, a low hum of wrongness, a sense that wanting wealth is somehow a character flaw. Most people assume that feeling is their conscience doing its job. They are wrong, not slightly wrong, completely, structurally, foundationally wrong. That feeling is not wisdom. It is not moral instinct. It is a program, one that was installed early, reinforced often, and designed to serve interests that were never yours. This chapter will show you exactly where that program came from, how it runs, and why it has been mistaken for virtue every single time it fires. That is the question sitting at the center of this chapter. Not whether you want wealth. You do. The question is why wanting it makes you feel like you should apologize. The last chapter ended by raising a question and left it unresolved. What would your financial life look like if the curriculum had been different? Sit with that for one more second before we move forward, because what you are about to hear is exactly what that different curriculum would have taught you. There is a name for the psychological framework that shapes how most people relate to money. Researchers in behavioral economics and social psychology have studied it under various labels, but the core of it can be described in two plain words: deficit psychology. The belief, installed quietly over years, that desire itself is dangerous, that wanting more than you have reveals something ugly about your character, that the good and decent person is the one who expects less, asks for less, and feels grateful for whatever arrives without reaching for it. Deficit psychology does not announce itself. That is what makes it so effective. It does not walk through the front door wearing a sign. It arrives in small moments. A parent sighing when you mention a price tag. A teacher assigning a book where the rich character is always the villain. A religious phrase repeated so often it stops sounding like a lesson and starts sounding like a law. Slowly, across years, a rule forms inside you. Wanting wealth is selfish. And selfish people are not good people. So if you want to be a good person, you must not want too much. Here is where it gets precise. The program does not simply make you feel guilty when you spend money. It makes you feel guilty when you accumulate it. Spending is fine. Spending is even encouraged, because spending keeps money moving through a system designed to profit from your consumption. But saving, building, positioning yourself for long-term financial independence, that is where the guilt arrives hardest. That is where the inner voice whispers things like, "Who do you think you are?" That is where your own psychology becomes the primary obstacle between you and the life you already know you deserve. Picture the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not geographically, financially. Think about what you wanted then. Think honestly about the moments when you had real opportunity to move toward it and something inside you pulled back. Not fear of failure, something quieter, something that felt almost like modesty, like you were keeping yourself in proportion to what was appropriate, like reaching further would have been greedy. That pull, that specific, subtle resistance, that is deficit psychology in operation. Solomon knew that pull better than almost anyone. He grew up in a house where money was tight and the tightness was worn like a badge. His parents were decent people. Hard workers. They taught him that people who chased wealth were not to be trusted, that real integrity lived in simplicity, that the neighbors down the street who drove nice cars were probably up to something dishonest. These were not lessons delivered as lessons. They were the water Solomon swam in from the time he could form a thought. By the time he was 28, Solomon had gotten a real promotion, a title change, and a salary that finally gave him room to breathe. He lasted 4 months before he found a way to give most of it back. Not literally. He did not hand anyone a check, but he started arriving late, making small errors that were not like him, taking on extra obligations that ate his time without adding income. His performance slipped just enough that the raise leveled off and the new title stopped meaning what it should have. His manager was confused. Solomon told himself he was just tired. He was not tired. He did it again at 31. A business idea that made real sense with a partner who had skills Solomon lacked. They got 3 months in, gained actual traction, and Solomon began to quietly undermine the process. Late responses, a tone in meetings that put his partner off, small hesitations that compounded into a full stop. The business dissolved before it ever reached its potential. He blamed the timing. He blamed his partner. He had not yet learned to look at the actual mechanism doing the damage. The mechanism was guilt, not conscious guilt. Nothing Solomon could point to in a single moment and say, "I am sabotaging this because I feel I do not deserve it." It was far more subtle than that. It operated the way water does when it finds a crack in concrete. Patient, quiet, inevitable. Every time he built upward past a certain invisible line, something in him read the situation as a violation and began correcting course. Back to appropriate, back to proportionate, back to the size a person like him was supposed to occupy. What Solomon experienced is not unusual. It is not even rare. The clinical term for what he lived through is self-handicapping. But the cause of it, in his case and in millions of cases like his, runs deeper than psychology textbooks tend to trace. Because the textbooks were written inside the same system that installed the program. Deficit psychology has academic respectability because it was built into the academic structure. The idea that desiring wealth is psychologically immature, that financially motivated people are compensating for emotional deficiency, that true fulfillment arrives through minimizing material ambition. These ideas have been published, cited, and taught with the same confidence as established fact. And they have been absorbed by an entire population that never got the counterargument. Here is the counterargument. Wanting financial security is not greed. It is not vanity. It is not compensation for inner poverty. In every measurable way, financial security gives people more capacity to do good, more capacity to care for family, more capacity to give, to create, to solve. The desire to build wealth, when it comes from a place of intention rather than fear, is one of the most constructive forces a human being can direct. The problem was never the wanting. The problem was what you were taught to do with the wanting. Later on, you will hear a point about motivation and money that clashes with the familiar story. Once you grasp that turn, it shifts how you actually behave when opportunity appears. But before we get there, something needs to be named clearly right now. The guilt you feel about wanting wealth is not your conscience. Your conscience is calibrated to help you act ethically, to protect you from real harm, to keep you honest in your dealings with other people. Your conscience is a useful instrument. But what fires when you think about accumulating money, building assets, charging what your work is worth? That is not your conscience. That is a program running in the background of your psychology. one that was installed by a culture and economy, and in some cases an education system that benefits when you consume and breaks down when you accumulate. Consumption keeps the system liquid. Accumulation gives the accumulator options. Options are power, and power, when it distributes too widely, disrupts the existing arrangement. This is not a conspiracy. You do not need shadowy boardrooms to explain it. Systems do not need to be deliberately designed in order to persistently produce a particular outcome. The outcome is simply what happens when enough small messages, all carrying the same frequency, are received by the same developing mind over enough years. The frequency of deficit. The frequency that says wanting more means you are less. Your work now is to begin distinguishing between the signal and the noise. The guilt is noise. The wanting is signal. The signal is pointing you toward something real and reachable. The noise is simply old code running on hardware that has since outgrown it. Solomon eventually made that distinction. It did not happen in one realization. It happened over months of learning to notice the specific moment when the pullback arrived, to name it for what it was rather than for what it had always pretended to be. He stopped calling it modesty. He stopped calling it wisdom. He called it by its actual name. And once something has a true name, it loses most of its power to operate in the dark. You already know the program is running. You identified it in the mirror a few paragraphs back. You felt it in the memory of the moment you pulled back from something real. The open question, the one this chapter planted at the start, has its answer now. The reason wanting wealth makes you feel like you should apologize is not because of who you are. It is because of what you were taught. That distinction is the beginning of everything. So here is the only thing that matters as you carry this forward. The guilt is not yours, but what you do next is. Chapter 3. Attunement is not manifestation, it is neuroscience. Thinking less about money is the fastest path to making more of it. That sounds like something printed on a motivational poster in a dentist's waiting room. Vague and slightly insulting. It is not. It is a precise description of how your brain's filtering system behaves when it is oriented toward an outcome versus when it is white-knuckling toward one. And the difference between those two states determines almost everything. What opportunities you notice. What actions you take. What kind of financial life you build over the next 5 years. You walked out of the last chapter with something important. The guilt that was trained into you does not belong to you. But the question that chapter left open was this. If the guilt was installed, what gets installed in its place? Not in theory, not as a concept. In the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday, when you are sitting at your desk, or riding the train, or lying awake at 3 in the morning, what does the corrected version of this actually feel like? That is the question this chapter answers. But first, you need to understand something about the piece of hardware sitting behind your eyes. Your brain receives approximately 400 billion bits of sensory information every single second. 400 billion. And yet the number of bits your conscious mind actually processes from that flood is somewhere between 2,000 and 40 bits per second. The rest gets filtered, discarded, treated as irrelevant before it ever reaches your awareness. The mechanism responsible for that filtration is called the reticular activating system. It is a dense cluster of neurons running through your brain stem. It functions in every practical sense as a gatekeeper for your conscious experience. The reticular activating system does not make moral judgments. It does not decide what matters because it is wise or virtuous or educated. It decides what matters based on one criterion only, what you have already told it to look for. That is the whole mechanism. That is the thing nobody explained in school. Think about the last time you decided to buy a specific car, a certain color, a certain model. Within 48 hours, you started seeing that exact car everywhere, parked outside your office, turning left at the intersection. It was not that those cars suddenly appeared. They were always there. Your reticular activating system simply had no reason to flag them as relevant before you made the decision. The moment you did, they moved from the ignored 400 billion to the processed 40,000. That is not mysticism. That is neuroscience. Here is where this connects to you and money, and why the connection matters more than any tip, any side hustle, any spreadsheet. Your reticular activating system filters for what matches your dominant expectation, not your wishes, not your vision board, your expectation. There is a specific difference between those two things. Most financial advice never touches it, because most financial advice is taught at the behavioral level. What to do with your money, not at the neurological level. Not what your brain is already primed to notice before you do anything at all. A wish is a desire held at a distance. An expectation is a conclusion your brain has already drawn about how the world works. If your dominant expectation is that money is hard to hold, that people like you struggle financially, that wealth belongs to a different category of person, then your reticular activating system spends its filtering power confirming that picture. It surfaces examples of failure and scarcity. It flags the risks before the opportunities. It makes you reach for familiar choices even when those choices have stopped working. This is not personal. This is not fate. It is a filter set to the wrong frequency. And here is the open loop you need to carry with you for a few minutes. This filter can be reset, but the method for resetting it is almost nothing like what you have been told to do. We will get there. First, a story. There was a woman named Claudette who managed customer accounts for a mid-sized logistics company in the mid-90s. She was precise in her work, dependable and completely convinced, in a quiet way she rarely examined, that her ceiling had already been established. Her parents had rented their whole lives. Her older brother had worked the same warehouse job for 11 years. She did not think of herself as limited. She just had a very settled picture of what was realistic. One afternoon, a regional vendor she had worked with for years offered her a small profit-share arrangement on a contract she had helped broker. It was not unusual exactly, but it was new. It was outside the category of things Claudette had ever done. The amount was modest, but she said yes, almost without thinking. Because she had spent 3 weeks prior reading about how small businesses structured their deals, not because she planned to start one. She had simply gotten curious, the way you get curious about things that feel adjacent to your life but not yet in it. What changed in those 3 weeks was not her ambition. It was her filter. She had fed her reticular activating system new input, quietly, almost accidentally. The result was not a lightning bolt. It was a Tuesday afternoon conversation that she recognized as a door, precisely because her brain had been configured recently to notice doors of that shape. 6 years later, Claudette ran her own operation. She would say, if you asked her, that the moment things changed was not dramatic at all. It was just a conversation she almost missed. The removed lesson, the one that never made it into the curriculum you were handed, is hidden inside Claudette's story. You do not need a new personality to build wealth. You do not need different genetics or different parents or a different starting line. You need a reticular activating system oriented toward a dominant expectation that matches what you are actually trying to do. And that is a trainable state. This is where the word attunement becomes precise rather than vague. Attunement is not manifesting. Manifesting, the way pop culture sells it, asks you to feel the feeling of having the thing, to vibrate at the frequency of your desire, to believe hard enough that the universe responds. There is a sliver of functional truth buried inside that framework. But it has been wrapped in so much mysticism that the functional truth is almost impossible to find. The functional truth is this: emotional states alter perception. When you consistently operate from a state of confident expectation, your reticular activating system processes information differently than when you operate from desperate hoping. The brain of someone who has already internally decided that financial growth is inevitable does not behave the same way as the brain of someone white-knuckling through a vision exercise they half believe. The filter is different. So what gets surfaced is different. So what gets acted on is different. Frequency is not a spiritual metaphor in this book. It is a description of the neurological baseline your brain operates from. It shapes every single thing your conscious mind notices and pursues. Now stop for a moment. Revisit the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not where you wanted to be. Where were you really? What was the ceiling you had quietly installed? What did you believe, not hope, but believe about whether financial security was actually in the cards for you? And how many doors, how many offers, how many strange and low-key opportunities appeared in that time and got passed over because your filter was not set to recognize them? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the audit. As this book keeps moving, you will hear a point about consistency that clashes with the familiar story. When that point settles, it shifts how you act every morning before you have done anything else. But for now, the most useful thing you can do is this. A dominant expectation audit. Here is what it involves. It takes less than 10 minutes. You sit somewhere quiet away from your phone. You think about money, not a specific amount, just the concept of financial growth in your own life. Then you notice with genuine honesty the first 3 thoughts that arrive, not the thoughts you want to have, the ones that actually show up, because those first 3 thoughts are a clean window into your current dominant expectation. If what shows up first is something close to, "This is possible for me, I have real evidence that I am moving in this direction, I know what the next step looks like," then your filter is already oriented close to where it needs to be. If what shows up first is, "I am already behind, this is for other people, I do not know how anyone actually makes this work," then your reticular activating system is currently set to find proof for those conclusions. And it will find that proof every single day. Because 400 billion bits of data contain evidence for almost any conclusion you ask your brain to confirm. The audit is not designed to make you feel bad about what you find. It is designed to make the filter visible. Because an invisible filter cannot be adjusted. You cannot tune an instrument you cannot hear. Deficit psychology, the framework that trained guilt into you about wanting more, also trained your dominant expectation downward. That was the deeper damage, quieter than the guilt and more persistent, the guilt you could feel and name. The expectation sits below the surface, generating your interpretations before you have a chance to question them. Closing this loop, the reset does not come from positive affirmations or forced belief. It comes from feeding new evidence to your reticular activating system in doses it can process as real. Claudette did it with reading. Others do it through proximity to people whose expectation baseline is higher than their own. Others do it through small financial wins they actually feel and register, rather than dismiss. The method is less important than the consistency. The filter recalibrates on volume. One new input does not move the needle. 30 days of new input begins to. The frequency is not mystical, it is neurological, and the question the next chapter will answer is, why did the most reliable method for setting this frequency get dropped from every mainstream framework that claimed to be teaching you how to succeed? Chapter 4. Your wealth ceiling is a psychological thermostat. Right now, money is leaving your life in a way you cannot fully see, not through bad decisions you made last week, not through some obvious mistake you can trace. It is leaving through the precise and automatic mechanism of a nervous system that has decided, somewhere below the level of your conscious thought, exactly how much financial security you are allowed to feel. Every dollar that tries to exceed that limit gets neutralized, spent, dismissed, converted back into the familiar. This is not metaphor. This is not a story designed to make you feel something. This is a documented psychological function, and it has been operating inside you since before you had a single opinion about money. The question this chapter will answer is not whether this mechanism exists in you. It does. The question is whether you can finally see it clearly enough to stop it. The previous chapter told you that the frequency is neurological, not mystical. It asked why the most reliable method for setting that frequency got quietly dropped from every framework that claimed to be teaching success. That answer is coming, but before it can mean anything to you, you need to see the mechanism itself in full light. You need to watch it work on someone who had every reason to break through. Here is what that looks like in real life. Solomon was 31 years old, working as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company in Memphis. He was good at his job, well-liked, and by every external measure fine. Not thriving, not desperate. Fine. He had about $400 in savings, 2 credit cards at 80% capacity, and a habit of telling himself he would get serious about money when things settled down. Things never settled down, but that is not the point of his story. One spring, Solomon's company landed a federal contract and handed out retention bonuses to keep key staff. Solomon received $6,200 in a single direct deposit. He stared at his phone screen for a long time. He told his wife that this was the moment. He said sincerely that they were going to use this to finally get ahead. He meant it completely. He was not lying to himself or to her. 11 weeks later, the $6,200 was gone. Some of it went to real things, a car repair that had been delayed too long, a doctor bill they had ignored for months. But close to $4,000 went to purchases that required, afterward, a significant amount of rationalization. A television that was on sale. A weekend trip that felt deserved. Several dinners that felt earned. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and call reckless. Solomon did not have a spending problem. Solomon had a thermostat. Think about how a thermostat actually works. You set it to 68 degrees. The room cools to 65 and the heat kicks on to correct it. The room warms to 71 and the air conditioning runs to bring it back down. The system does not evaluate whether 68 is the right temperature. It does not ask whether you might want something different today. It simply executes the return, constantly, automatically, without rest. Your nervous system does this with money, not with the number in your account exactly, but with your felt sense of financial safety. There is a level of security you have been calibrated to experience as normal. Your behavior, not your intentions, your actual behavior, bends toward returning you to that level whenever something pushes you away from it. Earn more than the set point and the spending accelerates almost invisibly. Drop below it far enough, and a burst of motivated effort kicks in to pull you back up. The system is not trying to keep you poor. It is trying to keep you familiar. That is the part that makes this so hard to fight. Familiarity feels like safety, and your nervous system, which was built to keep you alive and not to make you wealthy, treats those two things as identical. Here is the open question worth sitting with right now, before we go further. If the set point is real, and if it operates below conscious awareness, then who set it? You did not choose it deliberately. No rational part of you decided that $400 in savings and 2 maxed credit cards was the acceptable normal. So where did that calibration come from? And can it be changed? Hold that question. You will have the answer before this chapter ends. Psychologists who study this phenomenon sometimes call it financial homeostasis. The term borrows from biology, where homeostasis describes the body's tendency to maintain stable internal conditions, temperature, blood pressure, blood sugar. The body corrects constantly, quietly, automatically. Researchers found that the same corrective pattern appears in financial behavior. It is rooted not in greed or laziness, but in early, repeated experiences that taught your nervous system what normal looked like. You did not choose what you saw around money growing up. You absorbed it. The way adults in your early life spoke about bills, about opportunity, about what people like us do or don't do with money, all of that registered not as information but as calibration. Your nervous system filed it under. This is how the world works. This is the range within which safety exists, and it has been defending that range ever since. The uncomfortable truth is that education does not override this. Motivation does not override this. Even genuine desire does not override this. You can know every correct financial principle and still watch the money disappear. The knowing lives in your prefrontal cortex. The thermostat lives in the deeper, faster, older architecture of your nervous system. Knowing and doing are being managed by different systems. Rewind to your financial reality at that earlier moment. Not conceptually, specifically. What number sat in your account most months? What financial stress felt like in your body when it arrived? Now consider where you are today. Has the specific character of the problem changed, or has it mostly stayed the same while the surface details shifted? Different amounts, different categories, same feeling, same range. If that pattern is real for you, you are not looking at bad luck or lack of effort. You are looking at a thermostat holding its set point. That is not an accusation. It is a diagnosis, and diagnoses can be worked with. In a later section, you will hear a point about willpower and financial discipline that clashes with the familiar story. After that really registers, it shifts exactly how you approach the day-to-day decisions that seem small but are not. But for now, the question you have been holding deserves its answer. Where did the set point come from, and can it be changed? The set point was established through repetition and emotion, not through a single dramatic event, though sometimes a dramatic event locks one in faster. Primarily through the slow accumulation of ordinary moments. Each one sending a small signal to your nervous system about what money means, what it costs, what kind of people have it and what kind don't. Those signals layered over years until they became the default frequency your system runs on. And yes, it can be changed, not through motivation, not through information alone, through deliberate and repeated recalibration, exposing your nervous system to new experiences of financial safety, long enough and consistently enough that the system begins to register a higher level as normal. This is the removed lesson, not a secret in the conspiratorial sense, but a principle that got quietly sidelined when the mainstream success frameworks decided that behavior change was primarily a matter of information and willpower. It is not. It is a matter of felt experience. And you can create that experience intentionally. Here is the thermostat reset protocol. It works in 3 specific steps. The first step is to name the set point without judgment. Look at the financial pattern in your life over the past 3 years, not the story you tell about it, the actual pattern, and identify the range your account or your financial stress has been oscillating within. Write that range down somewhere, not to shame yourself, to see the thermostat's current setting clearly. You cannot adjust a calibration you refuse to look at directly. The second step is to create small but real experiences of expanded financial safety. Not visualization, not affirmation. Actual behavior that slightly exceeds the set point in a controlled way. Keep a small amount of money in your account past the moment your nervous system starts to itch toward spending it. Let the discomfort exist. Let the account hold more than feels normal for slightly longer than usual. This is not about the amount. $20 held past the discomfort point sends a signal. The signal is, this level of safety is survivable. That signal is what recalibrates the thermostat over time. The third step is to track the return impulse without obeying it. Every time you feel the pull to spend money that has exceeded your familiar threshold, or every time anxiety shows up when an unexpected bill drops you below it, notice it. Name it out loud if you can. This is the thermostat. Not to stop the feeling. To insert a sliver of distance between the signal and the automatic response. That distance is the beginning of choice. Solomon's story did not end with the bonus. About 2 years later, his company promoted him to regional manager. The salary increase was significant. He told his wife again that this was the moment. But this time, something was different. He had spent the previous year practicing these 3 steps, mostly imperfectly, occasionally forgetting entirely but returning to them. When the new income arrived, the usual pull came with it. He felt it clearly. He named it. And then he did something different, not dramatic, not perfect, just slightly different from what the thermostat demanded. He moved half the first extra paycheck into a separate account and left it there for 30 days without touching it. The discomfort was real. The urge to rationalize a reason to spend it was real. But the money stayed. And after 30 days, something in him registered. This level is survivable. This is what the beginning of recalibration feels like. Every unexplained backslide, every opportunity that slipped past, every windfall that disappeared before it could become something, none of it was bad luck. It was the thermostat doing what thermostats do, finding the familiar, enforcing the setting. The only way to live at a higher level of financial well-being is to convince your nervous system, through evidence and experience, that the higher level is safe. Information was never the missing piece. The missing piece was always attunement, learning to feel a different financial reality until your system accepts it as the new normal. What does your thermostat say your ceiling is? Chapter 5. Expectation is a financial instrument, not a feeling. Expectation does not prepare you for opportunity. It selects it. That sounds like a feel-good revision of how the world works. The kind of soft claim that gets printed on motivational calendars and forgotten by noon. It is not. It is a description of a filtering mechanism inside your brain that is running right now, deciding which parts of reality reach your conscious mind and which parts get quietly discarded before you ever know they existed. Once you understand what that mechanism actually does, the question from the last chapter stops being rhetorical. It becomes the most financially consequential question you have ever sat with. Here is what nobody told you in school. Your expectation is not a response to the world. It is a lens through which you process the world before you ever consciously respond to it. It determines what you see. It determines what you reach for, and it does this so automatically, so far below the level of deliberate thought, that most people go their entire lives without realizing the mechanism exists. They think they are responding to the world as it is. They are responding to the version of the world their expectation has already edited. That is the question this chapter is going to answer. Not how to want more. How to expect more precisely and functionally, so that the world you walk through starts revealing things it was always hiding from your current setting. Call up the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not in a general sense, be specific. What apartment? What job? What account balance? What did you think was possible for you then? Not what you hoped. What you genuinely, privately expected. Because if you are honest with yourself, whatever you expected back then is probably very close to what you actually have right now. The gap between what you wished for and what you expected is the gap between dreaming and operating. Most people dream at one frequency and expect at another. The dream is vivid and expansive. The expectation is quiet, narrow, and deeply familiar with disappointment. And your brain, not symbolically, not poetically, but neurologically, acts on the expectation. There is a man named Darius who worked as a facilities manager for a mid-sized commercial building in Cleveland. He had worked in the same industry for 11 years. He knew every vendor, every contractor, every supply chain quirk. And for 11 years, he had earned a solid but static salary, the same conversations with the same people, the same sense that the industry operated on rails he would never be allowed to drive. One afternoon he attended an industry conference with a colleague named Patrick. They walked the same floor, visited the same booths, sat through the same sessions. Same room, same hours, same conversations. On the drive home, Patrick said he had counted 5 separate business opportunities at that conference. 2 vendor gaps that created openings for a private supply reseller. 1 technology tool that 3 different booth contacts had said they wished existed. And 2 relationships with building owners who had mentioned specific operational problems they could not find good solutions for. Darius had seen none of it. He had not been distracted. He had not been on his phone. He had been present, engaged, and intelligent. He had simply not expected to find opportunity in that room. So his brain, acting with remarkable efficiency, had filtered it out before it could become conscious thought. Patrick had spent the previous 6 months reading about small logistics ventures and quietly telling himself that his next business was already somewhere in the next 12 months of his life. He had calibrated his expectation. And his brain had done exactly what a calibrated instrument does. It tuned to the signal. Now here is the part that matters. Darius was not less intelligent than Patrick. He was not less hardworking. He did not lack ambition in any conventional sense. He wanted a better life just as much. The difference was not hunger. The difference was what each of them had set as normal. What each of them had quietly decided, in the private language of the nervous system, was the expected range of what could happen to them. This is the frequency, not luck principle made concrete. Luck suggests that Patrick happened to be standing in the right spot when an opportunity flew past. That is not what happened. Patrick had tuned his perceptual system to detect a specific class of signal. Then he walked into a room full of those signals, and he received them. Darius walked through the same room receiving a different channel entirely. Your brain has a system for this. It is called the reticular activating system, and it is working constantly, sorting the approximately 11 million pieces of sensory information your environment is producing at any given second. You consciously process roughly 40 out of 11 million. Something has to decide which 40. And the thing that decides more than any other single factor is expectation. What your brain has been told through repetition and emotional reinforcement and quiet private belief is worth bringing to the surface. This is why the removed lesson matters, not as metaphor, as mechanism. When you were taught explicitly or culturally that wealth desire is suspect, that wanting more is a character flaw, that people like you don't end up in those positions, you were not just being handed a discouraging idea. You were being handed a perceptual filter, a calibration. And that calibration has been running in the background of every room you have ever walked into, quietly deciding what you are allowed to see. Deficit psychology did not make you less capable, it made you less receptive. There is a difference, and the difference is recoverable. So how do you change what the filter is set to? Not by wanting harder. Wanting is emotional, and emotion alone does not recalibrate a perceptual system. What recalibrates the system is dominant expectation, not hope. Not desire, expectation. Expectation is built through a specific process that has nothing to do with positive thinking and everything to do with consistent behavioral and cognitive signaling. You are essentially refiling the information about what is normal, what you should be watching for, what is yours to reach for when it appears. Here is how this distinction plays out practically. Hope says there might be something good in this room. Expectation says there is something in this room that belongs in my life, and I will recognize it when I see it. The nervous system responds to those two statements with completely different levels of attentiveness. Think of it this way. If you were walking through an airport and someone told you a friend of yours was somewhere in the building, you would scan every face with a specific quality of attention. You would process the crowd differently. You would not be more intelligent or more motivated than you were 2 minutes ago. You would be tuned to a different signal. That is what calibrated expectation does to every room you enter, every conversation you have, every article you skim, every offhand comment someone makes at a dinner that turns out to be the beginning of something. Let that image stay with you for a moment. Now consider the open loop sitting beneath this chapter since the beginning. You may have asked yourself whether expecting more is just wishful thinking dressed in clinical language. Whether this is really just old-fashioned optimism with a neuroscience coding. It is not. Here is why. Wishful thinking is passive. It sits back and hopes the world delivers. Calibrated expectation is active in the most specific sense. It changes the inputs your conscious mind receives. It changes which conversations you take seriously. It changes which emails you respond to. It changes how long you stay in a room that feels unfamiliar. It changes whether you ask the follow-up question or let the moment pass. These are not symbolic changes. These are behavioral changes with financial consequences, and they flow entirely from what your nervous system has been told to consider normal. This is expectation as a financial instrument, not a feeling, not a mood, not the emotional weather of a given morning. A calibrated mechanism that filters incoming information and routes it either toward your conscious attention or away from it. You hold this instrument right now. The question is whether it is tuned to the frequency that matches what you say you want, or whether it is still set to the frequency that was handed to you by a framework that never intended you to build wealth at all. Before long, you will hear a point about action. Specifically, the idea that doing more is the primary driver of financial acceleration that clashes with the familiar story. Once that becomes real to you, it shifts how you choose to spend your hours. But right now, the instrument in your hand is expectation, and it is not a passive organ waiting to be filled with the right experience. It is a tuning mechanism you can adjust, not all at once, not through declaration alone, but through the deliberate, repeated act of deciding what you expect to be true about your life before you walk into any room. Darius eventually learned what Patrick had been doing. He spent the following quarter doing the same thing, rereading not for information but for calibration, reattending not to network but to expect. 3 months later, he attended a smaller regional event, a fraction of the size of that original conference, and he came home with 2 business contacts and 1 conversation that became the beginning of a small consulting arrangement. That arrangement added $30,000 to his annual income within 18 months. Same man, same intelligence, different setting on the instrument. You are not waiting for better opportunities. You are waiting for the version of you that is tuned to receive the ones already in the room. Chapter 6. Scarcity language is programming your financial brain. Something is leaving you right now, not dramatically, not all at once. It is leaving in small, ordinary sentences you say dozens of times each week without thinking twice. Every time that phrase passes your lips or forms in your mind, your brain registers it as instruction. Then it goes to work proving it true. You do not know this is happening. That is the mechanism. That is what nobody sat you down and explained, that the everyday language you use to describe your financial life is not neutral commentary. It is code. And that code is running constantly, quietly in the background of every financial decision you make, every opportunity you assess, every risk you instinctively back away from. This chapter is about that code, where it came from, what it is doing to the structure of your financial reality, and more precisely than anything you have heard before, exactly how to rewrite it without lying to yourself. The previous chapter said something worth sitting with. You are not waiting for better opportunities. You are waiting for the version of you that is tuned to receive the ones already in the room. What tunes that version? Not motivation, not positive thinking, not a vision board above your desk. The primary signal that tunes your financial frequency is the language you speak about money, out loud and inside your own head. On an ordinary Tuesday when nothing is happening and everything is quietly being decided, there is an unanswered question under everything that follows all the way through. Why do 2 people in identical financial circumstances, same income, same city, same starting point, end up in entirely different places 5 years later when neither of them made any obviously dramatic decisions? The answer is not luck. It is not work ethic. It is not even opportunity. It is something quieter and more precise than all of those things combined. Language is older than conscious thought. Long before your brain developed its rational, planning, decision-making surface, it had a deeper system, a filtering system. Its entire job is to take the overwhelming flood of information the world sends you and reduce it to only what is relevant to your current dominant expectation. Neuroscientists call this the reticular activating system. The name matters less than the function. The function is this. Your brain actively edits reality based on what you have primed it to look for. And the most powerful primer in your daily life is not your intention. It is your habitual language. When you say money is tight, you are not describing your bank account. You are issuing an instruction. Your filter system hears that as your dominant expectation about money, that it is compressed, limited, squeezed. It immediately begins curating your perception of the world to match that expectation. Opportunities that do not fit the tight money frame get filtered out before they reach your conscious awareness. You literally do not see them, not because they are not there, because your brain, working efficiently and correctly based on the instructions it has received, has removed them from your attention before you ever had a chance to evaluate them. Bring to mind the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not the big things, the job, the relationship, the city. Think about the language you used around money. What was the phrase you repeated most? What did you say to friends when a bill arrived? What did you think to yourself when you saw a price tag that felt out of reach? Whatever that language was, trace it forward, not as blame, as data. Because the evidence is nearly always there, that the financial territory of your life 3 years later bore a remarkable resemblance to the expectation those phrases encoded. This is the removed lesson, the one that never made it into the curriculum. The educational framework was built, as we have been tracing through this book, on deficit psychology, the idea that wanting more is suspect, that aspiring beyond your circumstances is arrogant, and that describing financial struggle accurately is the honest and humble thing to do. What that framework never taught you is that honest and accurate are not the same thing. Saying money is tight might feel honest, but it is rarely accurate. It is almost always an interpretation, a story placed over a set of numbers, and that story, repeated enough times, becomes the instruction your nervous system acts on. Let me tell you about a man named Solomon. Solomon worked in logistics. He was 29, careful with money by most standards, not reckless, not extravagant. He paid his bills. He saved a little each month. By all visible measures, he was doing things right. But Solomon had a phrase he used constantly. Anytime money came up at dinner, with friends, with his partner, alone in the car, he said it without thinking. The phrase was simple. He said, "I just can never seem to get ahead." He meant it as observation. He said it the way you might comment on the weather, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, as a description of conditions. But here is what that phrase was doing inside his nervous system. Every time he said it, his brain confirmed it as the primary instruction for how to process financial information. Job postings that required a slight salary negotiation, filtered out, too complicated. A conversation with a coworker who had recently started a small side operation. Solomon was there for the conversation, but nothing registered as relevant. An online course that cost $200 and would have given him a specific certification his industry was actively seeking. He saw it once, thought it sounded expensive, and never looked again. He was not lazy. He was not unlucky. He was being perfectly obedient to the instruction he had been issuing himself for years. The phrase "I can never seem to get ahead" is not a description of circumstances. It is a prediction, and your brain is a prediction machine. It will work very hard to make your predictions accurate. Solomon did not change his income first. He changed the phrase first, not to something falsely positive. Not to "I am a millionaire" or "money flows to me easily," because his brain would have rejected that immediately as inconsistent with observable evidence. He changed it to something empirically honest. He started saying, "I am building a clearer picture of my options." That is all. Nothing dramatic. No affirmation. Just a sentence that was actually true, that pointed his filter system in a slightly different direction, toward options, toward picture building, toward clarity. Within 6 weeks of that single shift, he noticed the coworker's side operation again. This time it registered. He asked one question. That question opened a door that changed the next 3 years of his life without a single dramatic event. The lesson did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived the way most real things do, quietly, through a filter that had been cleaned. Here is the precise mechanism, stated as plainly as possible. Your language creates your expectation. Your expectation programs your filter. Your filter edits your perception of available reality. Your perception of available reality determines what options you actually respond to. Your response to available options is what people on the outside call your results. Most people try to change their results directly. They push on the last link in the chain and wonder why nothing moves. What you are learning in this book is to move the first link. Because when the first link shifts, every link that follows shifts with it. So let us do the audit, not to make you feel bad, to make you precise. The phrase money is tight becomes this. My current cash flow has a specific gap I am now identifying, not a lie. A redirect from vague scarcity to solvable specificity. Your brain responds to specificity. It cannot solve tight. It can begin to work on a gap with a size and a location. The phrase I cannot afford it becomes, that is not my current priority, or if the honest version is needed, I do not yet see how to make that work, but I am looking. The difference sounds subtle. The neurological difference is significant. Cannot afford places a ceiling. Do not yet places a timeline. Your brain treats those two framings as entirely different instructions. The phrase money goes so fast becomes, I have not yet built a clear system for where money goes. Empirically true, not falsely positive, but pointed toward a next action rather than toward a permanent condition. The phrase I will never be able to save enough becomes, I have not yet found the right number to start with. Small, honest, forward-facing, enough to keep the filter pointed toward possibility rather than locked onto impossibility. None of these replacements are magic. None of them pretend your circumstances are different from what they are. That is not the point, and it never was. The point is that your brain cannot build towards something it has been instructed to treat as permanently out of reach. Precision is what clears the filter. Precision is what attunes the frequency. Not false optimism, not manufactured enthusiasm. Just language that is honest about where you are and is pointed, however slightly, toward what can change. Down the line in this book, you will hear a point about motivation that clashes with the familiar story. When that idea snaps into focus, it shifts how you act, specifically around the moments when your language is most likely to collapse back into scarcity under pressure. But that is ahead of you. Right now, the thing to carry forward is this. Every time you say money is tight, money goes fast, or I cannot afford it, you are not describing reality. You are instructing your filter system to produce more evidence of it. The frequency you speak in is the frequency you receive on. Chapter 7. The weather inside you is making every decision. Thinking about money less is one of the fastest paths to building more of it. That sounds like advice designed to keep you exactly where you are. It is not. It is an observation about what separates people who accumulate wealth steadily from people who obsess over every dollar and still find themselves short. The obsession is not the engine. The engine is something quieter. Consistent wealth builders do not spend more mental hours on money. They spend those hours from a completely different psychological position. And that position changes every single decision they make before they are even conscious of making it. If you have ever wondered why two people can read the same financial book, take the same advice, and land in completely different places 5 years later, this chapter is the answer you have been waiting for. The last chapter left you with something worth sitting with. The frequency you speak in is the frequency you receive on. Hold that. Because what you are about to understand is the layer underneath the speaking, the atmospheric condition that gives the words their weight. The weather inside you is not what you say. It is the climate from which all your words, choices, and instincts arise. Here is the open question that will live in the background of this chapter until it gets answered. If two people have the same financial information, the same income, even the same stated goals, what explains why one of them builds and one of them burns through? The word most people reach for is discipline, willpower, habits. Those answers are not wrong, but they are downstream answers. They describe outputs. They do not describe the source. Discipline is the rain. What you need to understand is the weather system producing it. Picture two offices, same building, same floor. Marcus is a graphic designer who earns $52,000 a year. Every Monday morning he opens his banking app, feels a drop in his chest, closes it, and tells himself he will sort everything out when things get better. He is not careless. He is not unintelligent, but his internal weather is a low-grade storm. It is not catastrophic enough to force action. It just hums beneath everything, producing small decisions that cost him more than he realizes. He picks the restaurant because he does not want to seem like the person who suggests somewhere cheap. He delays calling about the erroneous charge on his phone bill because engaging with it feels heavier than ignoring it. He clicks on the credit card offer because the possibility of more room feels like relief. None of those decisions are large on their own. Together, they are the architecture of stalling. Now take Yemi. Yemi grew up in a household where money was spoken about the way illness is spoken about in some families, always in crisis, always arriving as bad news, always carrying fear underneath it. By the time she was 24 and earning her own income, her relationship with money had the same texture it always had: emergency energy. She was not spending wildly. She was not irresponsible. But her internal weather had been shaped by 18 years of watching her mother's face change whenever a bill came through the door. That expression had become her own silent reflex. She described it later as feeling like she was always one number away from the floor falling through. Yemi had a moment at 25, not a dramatic one, not a breakdown or a windfall, just a quiet Tuesday where she sat across from a colleague named Dana, who earned almost exactly what she did. Dana was describing, without anxiety, how she had moved money into a small index account and was letting it sit. Not excited, not anxious, just matter of fact, as if money were a tool and she were simply using it. Yemi said the calmness in Dana's voice hit her like something physical, not the information. The weather. Over the next 18 months, Yemi did something that looks unremarkable from the outside. She began studying her own reactions to money moments rather than the money itself. When she felt the tightening, when a number on a screen produced that familiar drop, she paused and named the feeling without feeding it. She started opening her banking app every morning for 60 seconds, not to fix anything, just to stop making it a place she was afraid to look. She paid one small bill with deliberateness instead of relief. She noticed when she was spending from the low-grade storm versus from something steadier. This is not a story about a budget. It is a story about weather modification. By month 7, the reflex had begun to change. By month 14, the baseline had shifted. Not because her income had jumped, not because she had read a book with the perfect system, but because she had dismantled the atmospheric condition that was producing scarcity-aligned decisions without her consent. Here is your mirror moment. Step back to your financial reality at that earlier moment. Not what you earned, not what happened. Think about what the weather felt like inside you every time money came up as a topic, as a number on a screen, as a conversation you needed to have. Was it clear? Was it that low-grade storm? Was it a freeze? Now think about this moment right now. Has that weather shifted at all? Has it become heavier? Has something in what you have been taking in through these chapters started to alter the atmospheric pressure, even slightly? That shift is not small. That shift is the whole thing. Here is what the research that never made it into standard financial education actually points to. Not the behavioral economics papers published in academic journals, not the pop psychology summaries. The deeper vein of work on psychological baseline states and decision architecture shows something that deficit psychology actively works against. Wealth builders are not wired differently from birth. They operate from a baseline of sufficiency, not wealth, not excess. Sufficiency. The internal sense that what is here now is workable, that today is not an emergency. From that baseline, decisions change in texture. A person operating from a scarcity baseline sees $100 surplus and feels a complicated mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because it exists, anxiety because it could disappear. The instinct is often to spend it or grip it. Both of those are emergency responses. A person operating from a sufficiency baseline sees the same $100 and experiences it as a unit of future capability. The instinct is placement, not because they are more virtuous, because the weather producing the instinct is different. This is the attunement the removed lesson pointed toward. When the psychological curriculum that informed how we teach financial behavior was stripped of its roots in internal state work, this distinction got lost. You were taught to build better habits. You were not taught that habits are atmospheric outcomes. You were taught to earn more and spend less. You were not taught that the condition from which you earn and spend determines whether either instruction sticks. A little later, you will run into an idea about motivation and wealth that pushes directly against the usual belief. Once that lands, it reshapes how you handle the feeling of wanting more. But right now, the thing that needs to land is this. The internal weather is not a metaphor for attitude. It is a description of a functional psychological state that produces measurable behavioral outputs. Yemi's shift was not a personality change. It was a recalibration of baseline. And it changed what she noticed, what she chose, what she tolerated, and what she walked away from. By month 18, she had opened a small investment account, not a large one. She described the amount as almost embarrassing, but the act of opening it was not the point. The point was that she opened it from a steady morning, not from a moment of crisis-fueled resolution. She was not trying to claw her way out of something. She was placing something into something else. The emotional signature of that act was completely different from any financial move she had made before it. That difference in emotional signature is frequency, not luck. Now think about Marcus again. His stalling is not moral failure. It is weather. The drop in his chest when he opens the app is not weakness. It is a conditioned atmospheric response to a repeated stimulus. And here is what matters most. It is not permanent. Weather can change. Not through denial. Not through positive thinking layered on top of unexamined fear. But through the same process Yemi used, sustained, deliberate exposure to the thing that triggers the storm, combined with a practice of naming rather than feeding the reaction. 60 seconds of looking without fixing. One deliberate action completed with steadiness instead of avoidance. Week by week, the atmospheric condition begins to shift. The decisions that emerge from it begin to shift with it, not because the person changed who they are, because the weather producing their choices changed what felt natural. You do not need more information about money. You need a different internal climate from which to act on the information you already have. The removed lesson was never about earning strategies or investment formulas. It was about this, the psychological attunement underneath all of it, the background state that makes wealth-aligned behavior feel ordinary rather than heroic. The reason two people with identical knowledge end up in different places is not discipline, not luck, not even opportunity. It is weather. Now here is the question that closes the loop you have been carrying through this chapter. If two people have the same information and the same income, what explains the gap? The gap is the gap between their internal climates. And internal climates, unlike talent, unlike circumstance, unlike the market, are things you can actually change. You are not behind because you lack the right strategy. You are operating in weather that was given to you before you were old enough to choose it. The first step to changing your results is changing the atmospheric condition from which you make every decision that produces them. Chapter 8. The body keeps the financial score too. Something is being taken off your side of the table as you listen. It is not your work ethic. It is not your intelligence. It is not even your time, though time is part of it. What is being taken is the compounding value of every financial decision you did not make, every account you did not open, every number you did not look at, every conversation about money you changed the subject on. Because somewhere in your body, not your mind, a signal fires that says danger, and you listen to it. You always listen to it, not because you are weak or careless or afraid of success, because you were never told that the signal itself was the problem. You were never taught that the way your body responds to financial information is a learned program, encoded long before you had any choice in the matter. And that program, running quietly beneath your awareness, has been costing you compounding amounts of real money for years. This chapter is about that program. More importantly, it is about how to interrupt it. That atmospheric condition the previous chapter described, the inner weather from which every financial decision is made, it does not live in your thoughts alone. Thoughts are downstream. The atmosphere is created earlier, deeper, in the place where your nervous system reads the world before language has a chance to interpret it. Here is the open question that will sit with you through the first half of this chapter. Why do two people with identical information make completely opposite financial decisions? Same income, same neighborhood, same access to the same books and podcasts and advice. One builds slowly and consistently. The other stays in place or moves backward. The standard answer is mindset, but mindset is still too abstract to be useful. The real answer lives inside the body. This is not a metaphor. It is physiology. Early psychological research, before the field was taken over entirely by cognitive models in the mid-20th century, spent significant time studying what was then called somatic response. That is the body's physical reaction to perceived threat or reward. Researchers at the time observed something that should have changed the entire way we talk about money and behavior. They noticed that the same stimulus could produce entirely different physical responses in different people, and that those responses dictated behavior more reliably than stated intention did. A person could say they wanted to save money, believe fully that they wanted to save money, and still find themselves spending compulsively the moment financial stress peaked, because the body had a different instruction. That research line was largely abandoned when cognitive behaviorism became dominant. The lesson was removed, not by conspiracy, but by academic fashion. When the mind became the unit of analysis, the body became a footnote. Wealth-building behavior got filed under rational choice theory, and the conversation about what the nervous system does with money, which was never finished, was quietly shelved. You inherited that incomplete education. Travel back to that stretch 3 years back before memory softens it with your finances. Not the big picture, the small, daily texture of it. Did you check your bank account every morning, or did you develop reasons not to? When a bill arrived, did your chest tighten before you even opened it? When someone mentioned investing or retirement accounts in a casual conversation, did something in you slightly exit the room? You do not have to answer aloud, but notice whether any of those descriptions carry a faint physical recognition, a small yes somewhere in your chest or stomach. That recognition is the point. That tightening, that avoidance, that interior exit, none of it is a character flaw. It is protection. The body learned at some point that financial information was a threat signal. Maybe it learned this from a parent who went rigid when money was discussed, passing the signal silently through tone and posture. Maybe it learned it from a specific moment of scarcity, a cut-off notice, a conversation overheard through a wall, a time when checking the balance meant confirming a fear. However it happened, the learning was real. And real learning in the nervous system does not stay in the past. It projects forward. It runs as default code every time a similar stimulus appears. So when you sit down to look at your finances now, your nervous system does not know it is a different day. It knows the pattern, and it fires the old signal. Here is a woman named 𝗓𝗓. She is 29, earns a reasonable salary, has a 401k she enrolled in automatically at onboarding and has not looked at since. Every few months she thinks about reviewing her accounts, making a plan, doing the things she knows she should do. She opens the app. The numbers appear. Something in her goes flat and distant. Within 40 seconds she has closed the app and opened something else: social media, a text thread, anything that returns her to ordinary sensation. She is not lazy. She is not bad with money. 𝗓𝗓 is experiencing dissociation, a mild and extremely common nervous system response to stimuli coded as threatening. Her body is doing exactly what it was built to do: protect her from what it has learned to read as danger. The cost is not dramatic. It does not feel like a catastrophe. It feels like nothing, which is exactly the problem. 𝗓𝗓 does not know that her 401k has an allocation she chose at 22 that no longer fits her goals. She does not know her emergency fund is $300 short of 1 month's rent. She does not know she is paying a recurring subscription she canceled in her mind 6 months ago, but never canceled in fact. She cannot know these things because she cannot stay in the room with the information long enough to receive it. And what you cannot see, you cannot change. The avoidance is the cost. This is the revelation. It is worth sitting with before moving past it. If looking at your bank balance produces a physical stress response, you will unconsciously avoid the information needed to build wealth. Not sometimes. Systematically, structurally. The very data that would allow you to act intelligently gets filtered out before it reaches conscious decision-making. Avoidance is not laziness. It is protection. And protection that was once useful becomes, over years, the invisible architecture of financial stagnation. The cognitive approach to this problem says, reframe your thoughts about money. Replace scarcity thinking with abundance language. This approach is not wrong exactly, but it is working at the wrong level. You do not think your way out of a somatic response any more than you think your way out of a flinch. You have to work at the level where the flinch lives. This is what the body-based work in early psychology was circling before it got abandoned. Regulation, not suppression. Not positive thinking applied over a stress response like paint over rust. Actual nervous system regulation which changes the signal itself. And here is where the removed lesson becomes practical. There is a practice, grounded in the same somatic research that was sidelined, that you can use specifically in the context of financial engagement. It is not complicated. Its simplicity is its power. Before you open any financial app, any account, any spreadsheet or statement, before you engage with money information at a level that typically triggers your stress response, stop. Place one hand flat on your sternum. That is the center of your chest, just below the collarbone. Press gently, not hard. Just enough to feel your own hand there. Now breathe in for 4 counts slowly through the nose. Hold it for 2. Breathe out for 6 counts through the mouth, slightly longer than the inhale. Do this 3 times. Then open the account. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but what it is doing is real. The extended exhale activates the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, the one that signals safety rather than threat. The hand on the sternum provides physical self-contact, which research in somatic regulation consistently shows reduces cortisol response. You are not tricking yourself. You are resetting the physiological condition under which your nervous system receives financial information. You are changing the atmospheric condition of the body before you ask it to engage with data it has been coded to fear. Do this consistently and the association begins to shift, not overnight, but the body learns through repetition the same way it learned the old pattern. You are writing a new pattern over the same neurological substrate. You are, in the most literal sense, reattuning. Attunement. This word has appeared before in this book. It will appear again in a different context later, specifically around what happens when your nervous system is finally calibrated to receive rather than repel, and what that calibration makes possible that effort alone never could. But for now, the attunement is this. The wealth frequency you want to live at is not just a financial state. It is a physiological one. The people who consistently build wealth are not smarter or luckier. They have, somehow, through upbringing or circumstance or sometimes deliberate work, developed a nervous system that can stay present with financial information without converting it into threat. They can look at a number without the number collapsing into an identity. They can tolerate uncertainty long enough to act with intention rather than reaction. That tolerance is not a personality trait. It is a trained physical state, and you can train it. The open question from earlier in this chapter, why 2 people with identical information make completely opposite financial decisions, the answer is not mindset. The answer is regulation. One person's body reads the information as workable, the other's reads it as threatening. Everything downstream from that initial signal flows differently. Differently structured decisions, different risk tolerance, different consistency, different results, same information, different bodies. Your body is not your enemy in this. It never was. It was trying to protect you with the only tools it had available when it learned the pattern. What it needs now is not criticism. It needs a new signal, a different atmospheric condition. The chance to learn that financial information, however uncomfortable it sometimes is not the same thing as danger. It is data. And data, received by a regulated nervous system, becomes direction. The body has been keeping the financial score all along. Now you get to decide what the next line of that score sounds like. Chapter 9. Proximity to wealth changes your frequency instantly. Spending time around wealth before you have it is not inspiration. It is reprogramming. That sounds like the kind of advice a life coach puts on a motivational poster, and you are right to be suspicious of it. But this is not about inspiration. It is about what actually happens inside your nervous system when the ambient evidence around you changes. Every psychology textbook that skipped this principle did you a specific, measurable harm. Here is what that harm looks like. You have spent years inside environments that treat financial struggle as the norm, not because anyone planned it that way, because environments are self-reinforcing. The people around you talk about money the way their parents talked about money. The rooms you enter confirm what you already believe. And your nervous system, which is always reading its surroundings for safety data, keeps updating its internal model with the same inputs. Scarcity looks like evidence. Evidence becomes certainty. Certainty becomes identity. And here is the question that should sit with you for a moment. What if the environment itself has been the instruction all along? Hold that. Because the answer is coming, and it is not the one most people expect. The previous chapter left you with this. The body has been keeping the financial score all along. Now you get to decide what the next line of that score sounds like. That line is not written with thoughts alone. It is written with exposure, with physical placement. With the new data your nervous system receives when you put yourself inside spaces where wealth is not the exception but the ordinary background hum of the room. Go back to the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not financially, spatially. What rooms were you in? What conversations were you overhearing? What did the people around you assume was possible? Not what they told you was possible. What they assumed without discussion, without ceremony, as a baseline fact of the world they lived in. The assumptions in a room are louder than the words. You absorb them without noticing. You calibrate to them the way your eyes calibrate to the light, automatically, completely, without your permission. This is what deficit psychology never taught you. It studied why poor people stay poor and concluded the answer was internal mindset, habits, beliefs. And those things matter, but it missed the mechanism. Beliefs are not just thoughts you think in private. They are conclusions your nervous system draws from the evidence it is repeatedly handed. Change the evidence and the conclusions begin to shift. Not instantly, the way a switch flips, but steadily, the way a room warms when someone finally turns on the heat. Proximity to wealth is that heat source. And before you say you cannot access it without money, let me introduce you to 𝗜𝗍𝗓𝗓. 𝗜𝗍𝗓 was 26 and working a property management job that paid him just enough to feel like movement but not enough to actually move. He was good at his job, organized, reliable, quick on problems. But every apartment he managed was in a neighborhood where the conversations in the stairwells were about making rent, not building equity. He drove the same route to work every day. He ate lunch at the same 2 places. His social world was tight and familiar and warm, and he loved the people in it. But every single one of them thought the way he thought about money. One day, a property he managed received a new owner, a commercial developer named 𝗓𝗓𝗓 who was in her mid-40s and ran 3 holding companies out of a modest office on the east side of town. 𝗓𝗓𝗓 was not flashy. She drove a 12-year-old car and wore the same 4 blazers in rotation. But the way she talked about capital was different. Not louder, not smarter, just different in register. Like she was discussing weather patterns that she understood and he did not even know he was standing inside. 𝗜𝗍𝗓𝗓 started asking her questions, small ones at first. She answered them directly, without condescension, the way someone answers questions about their own neighborhood when a visitor seems genuinely curious. After 3 months of these conversations, 𝗜𝗍𝗓𝗓 noticed something. He was not more inspired. He was less afraid. The decisions she described as ordinary moving capital from one vehicle to another, thinking about a 10-year return, treating a single property as a data point rather than an end goal, had begun to feel less like a foreign language and more like a dialect he was starting to recognize. He had not changed his income. He had changed his exposure. That is the mechanism. That is what proximity does. Now here is where most people stall. They hear this and they think it means they need wealthy friends, expensive events, or access to rooms they cannot yet afford to enter. That is not what this principle requires. There are 3 ways to access the proximity effect that cost you nothing, depend on no existing connections, and work at the level your nervous system actually operates. The first is environmental immersion without participation. You go to the places where wealth is the ambient standard, and you sit inside that environment without needing to perform within it. A hotel lobby in a well-positioned part of your city, a library in a neighborhood that funds its own institutions, a public park adjacent to a district where the businesses have capital behind them. You are not pretending. You are not lying to yourself. You are simply placing your nervous system inside a room where the background data is different. You let it read that room. You let it update its model of what is normal. Your body does not care whether you own the chair you are sitting in. It cares about what the room is telling it is real. The second is occupational proximity. You take a role, even a junior one, even a temporary one, that places you inside an organization where financial decisions above your current level are being made around you. Yemi did not seek this out strategically. It arrived by accident, but you can seek it deliberately. A front desk position at a firm that handles investment properties. A support role at a company where founders and operators are having real capital conversations in earshot. An internship, a part-time contract, a volunteer role in an organization with serious money flowing through its mission. You are not there to network in the performing sense. You are there to overhear, to be inside the room where wealth frequency is the ambient hum. Your nervous system is doing the work even when your conscious mind is focused on answering phones. The third is informational proximity. Not inspiration content, not motivation. Informational proximity means you regularly consume the primary language of wealth, earnings calls, property investment analyses, business owner interviews focused on decision-making rather than success stories, trade publications, financial planning frameworks. Not because you are studying for a test, because language shapes what your nervous system treats as normal. When you hear a decision made in a register you have never heard before, it sounds foreign. Threatening even. Your body marks it as outside your category. When you hear that same type of decision made 50 times over 4 months, your system stops flagging it as alien. It becomes recognizable. And what your system recognizes, it stops resisting. This is the removed lesson. Not removed cruelly, not removed with deliberate malice, but removed effectively, which in the end produces the same result. Standard psychology curriculum gave you the interior landscape of scarcity. It mapped the thinking patterns of people who stay financially stuck. It gave you a diagnosis and stopped there, as though naming the pattern was enough. What it did not give you was the environmental mechanism for overriding it, because that mechanism is not about what you believe. It is about what your nervous system is repeatedly exposed to until exposure becomes familiarity, and familiarity dismantles the signal your body has been treating as a warning. Frequency is not a metaphor here. It is a description of what your nervous system is actually doing. When you are inside a scarcity environment, your threat response is at a low chronic simmer. Small, mostly below notice, but present. And that simmer shapes every financial decision you make, because every decision runs through a system that is already reading the world as slightly dangerous, slightly not enough, slightly out of reach. Proximity interrupts that simmer. Not permanently, not with a single visit to a different room, but cumulatively the way sunlight is not a cure, but is a condition your body requires to function. You require regular exposure to environments where wealth is ordinary, not because you need the fantasy, because you need the new data. And now, the question from early in this chapter, the one about whether environment has been the instruction all along. The answer is yes, it has. Every room you have ever entered has been instructing your nervous system about what is real, what is reachable, and what is meant for someone like you. You have been receiving that instruction your whole life without being told it was happening. You cannot think your way to a new wealth frequency. The thought alone runs through the same old system. But you can place yourself, repeatedly, deliberately, in environments where the frequency is already different, where wealth is the background assumption, the ambient standard, the furniture of the room. And you can let your system update the way all biological systems update, by being inside different conditions long enough for those conditions to become the new baseline. Yemi is not rich yet. He is moving differently, and the difference between those two states is not as large as the gap looks. Further on, you will run into an idea about desire and financial attainment that pushes directly against the usual belief. When that becomes clear, it reshapes how you decide, not just what you want. For now, the room you enter tonight is already teaching your nervous system something. Make sure it is the lesson you need. Chapter 10. Compound attention creates compound returns. Something is slipping away from you right now. Not dramatically. Not in a way that shows up on a bank statement. It is draining the way a slow leak in a tire drains, quietly daily, until one morning you are flat on the side of the road wondering how you missed the signs. What is draining is not money, exactly. It is the attention that would have found the money. Every hour your mind spends circling anxiety, distraction, or noise that does not build your financial life is an hour that compounds in the wrong direction. And here is what makes this loss so invisible. You do not feel it leaving. You only feel its absence years from now, when you look at where you are and try to calculate how you got here. The mechanism causing this loss has a name. It is called diffused attention. It is the silent tax most people pay every single day of their financial lives without ever knowing they are paying it. This chapter is about that tax. And more importantly, it is about how to stop paying it. The previous chapter ended with a reminder. Make sure it is the lesson you need. That sentence matters more here than perhaps anywhere else in this book, because the lesson in this chapter is deceptively simple. Simple enough that you might dismiss it. Simple enough that your mind might categorize it as something you already know. If you let that happen, you will miss the most actionable principle in the entire book. So before you move forward, set the expectation. What you are about to hear is not complicated, but it is not being applied in your life right now. Both of those things are true. Hold them both. Here is a question worth sitting with. What did you think about for the first 20 minutes after you woke up this morning? Not what you intended to think about. What actually occupied your mind? For most people, the answer involves something that has nothing to do with building financial security. The morning scroll. A conversation that did not go well yesterday. A bill, the weather, the news. None of those things are wrong on their own, but each of them is a claim on your attention. Attention, it turns out, is not just a productivity concept. Attention is the raw material of financial behavior. What you consistently attend to is what you consistently move toward. That is not a metaphor. That is the mechanical description of how human behavior is actually organized. Consider a woman named Priya. She worked for 8 years at a mid-sized logistics company, earned a decent salary, and by every external measure was doing fine. She paid her bills. She had a little saved. But at 31, she looked at her account and realized she had not actually grown financially in 3 years. The number was roughly the same as it had been when she was 28. The raises had been absorbed by lifestyle. The savings had covered emergencies. The investment account she had opened 2 years prior had $47 in it, not because she was careless, not because she was bad with money, but because every week she gave the vast majority of her available attention to her job, her relationships, her health, her entertainment, and almost none of it to the domain of wealth specifically. Wealth was something that was supposed to happen alongside the rest of her life, automatically. She never sat down with it, never read about it with focus, never spent deliberate time understanding how money actually moved through her particular life. One day, a coworker mentioned offhandedly that she had started spending 15 minutes each morning reading about personal finance before she looked at her phone for anything else. Not because she loved finance, but because she had decided that if she was ever going to think differently about money, she had to deliberately expose her mind to it every day. Priya thought the idea sounded almost insultingly simple, but she tried it anyway. She started reading for 15 minutes each morning. Some days she read about investing, some days about behavioral economics. Some days she just sat with her own numbers and traced where her money had gone the previous week. Within 6 weeks, she noticed something she could not fully explain. A freelance opportunity that had existed in her circle for over a year had somehow become visible. A small but meaningful change in how she was allocating her income revealed itself as obvious. She had not gotten smarter. She had gotten more attuned to the frequency of wealth, and the frequency had begun returning what she was broadcasting into it. That word, attuned, is not accidental. Attention shapes perception. Perception shapes what you notice. What you notice shapes what you act on, and what you act on is what compounds. This is not motivational language. This is the actual architecture of how decisions get made in a human life. Think of it this way. Imagine a radio that has never been tuned to a particular station. The signal exists. It is broadcasting continuously, but because the dial is set to static, you hear nothing. Now imagine turning the dial slowly, deliberately, every single morning back toward that station. The signal does not get stronger, but your ability to receive it does. That is what compound attention does to wealth building. It does not change the number of opportunities available to you. It changes your capacity to detect and act on the ones that were already there. This is the principle that was quietly removed from everything most of us were taught about money. We were taught to earn more and spend less, save a percentage, avoid debt. These are mechanical instructions. They treat money as a behavior management problem. But the people who actually build wealth over time do something structurally different. They pay consistent, deliberate daily attention to the domain of wealth, not obsessively, not anxiously, attentively. There is a difference between anxiety about money and attention to money, and that difference is everything. Anxiety is reactive. It is pulled by fear and contracts around problems. Attention is proactive. It is directed by intention and expands toward possibility. Revisit to your financial reality at that earlier moment. Not your salary, your relationship to money. How often you thought deliberately about it. How much time you spent understanding it. How clearly you could describe the movement of money through your life at any given moment. For most people, that picture has not changed much in 3 years. The income may have shifted, but the underlying relationship to the domain of wealth, the level of deliberate engagement with it, has stayed roughly constant. and so the results have stayed roughly constant. This is the mirror moment, not to judge what you see, but to see it clearly, because you cannot move from a location you refuse to acknowledge. Now here is where the open question from the start of this chapter closes. The invisible mechanism was named as diffused attention. But diffused compared to what? The answer is this: compared to concentrated, compounding, daily attention applied to one domain. Compound interest in finance works because a small amount, consistently applied over time, creates returns that are disproportionate to the input. Compound attention works on the exact same principle. 15 minutes a day of focused, deliberate engagement with the domain of wealth creates perceptual returns that are wildly disproportionate to the time invested. Not because 15 minutes is magic, because consistency is magic. The brain is a pattern recognition system. When you give it the same domain to examine every single day, it begins to build structures for noticing that domain automatically. It starts doing the work for you even when you are not consciously directing it. Ideas surface in the shower. Connections appear in conversations. Numbers that seemed opaque begin to make sense intuitively. The wealthy are not smarter than you. Research across economic studies consistently finds that raw intelligence does not predict wealth at the individual level nearly as well as behavioral consistency does. What the wealthy have, in many cases without consciously naming it, is a more consistent, attentive relationship to the domain of financial decision-making. They think about it more. They talk about it more. They notice more of the signals that point toward it. Not because they were born that way. Because at some point, whether by design or circumstance, they began directing attention to wealth with regularity, and the regularity compounded. Here is the practice. 15 minutes a day, not passive consumption, not scrolling financial news until anxiety spikes. 15 minutes of deliberate, focused attention on one specific aspect of your financial life. One day you read one article about how index funds actually work, and you take one note. One day you open your bank account and trace every transaction from the previous week and name each one clearly. One day you read about a financial concept you have always half understood and you sit with it until it clicks. One day you write down, without judgment, the 3 financial decisions available to you right now that you have been avoiding. The topic changes. The focus does not. The commitment to showing up daily inside the domain of wealth stays constant. This is the removed lesson in action, not a secret formula, not a suppressed system. Just the quiet, steady, daily act of giving your mind to the thing you say you want. The frequency of wealth is not broadcast on a channel you need special access to receive. It is available to anyone whose attention is consistently turned toward it. You have been taught to desire wealth and simultaneously to distrust that desire. The diffusion of your attention across everything except wealth is the natural result of that training. And what you are doing now in this book is retuning. Soon, you will run into an idea about motivation and financial discipline that pushes directly against the usual belief. After that clicks, it reshapes how you actually show up each day. For now, the principle is this: attention, applied consistently to one domain, is not a soft skill. It is a compounding asset, and the question that walks you into the next chapter is deceptively sharp. What has your attention been earning? Chapter 11. The frequency is already inside you waiting. Trying harder to become wealthy is often what keeps you poor. That sounds like an excuse for laziness. It is not. It is a precise observation about what happens inside a person who is straining toward something they secretly believe they were never supposed to have. Straining is what belief in distance looks like. And you cannot close a distance you are convinced is permanent. Here is the part most people miss. You were not born believing you were bad with money. You were not born believing wealth was for other kinds of people. You were not born with a ceiling above your head. That ceiling was built, beam by beam, over years of careful instruction from people who had their own ceilings and could not imagine yours being any higher. This chapter is not about acquiring something new. It is about recognizing something old. The frequency you have been searching for, the specific attunement that draws consistent wealth-building behavior out of you almost automatically, was inside you long before anyone told you it could not be. That question did not disappear when the chapter ended while we keep going. What has your attention been earning? Sit with that for just one more moment. The answer you gave yourself, even silently, points directly to where your internal attunement is currently set. The setting is not permanent. It never was. Here is the open loop you need to hold through this chapter. If the frequency was always inside you, why does recovering it feel so difficult? That question has an answer. You will get there before this chapter ends. But first, you need to understand what actually happened to it. Think about a child. Not a hypothetical, soft-focused child in a commercial. Think about a real child, maybe one you know. Maybe yourself at 6 or 7 years old. Children ask for things without guilt. They want the biggest piece, the loudest toy, the front seat of the car. They do not apologize for wanting. They do not preemptively shrink their desires to avoid seeming greedy. They simply want openly and without negotiation. There is no scarcity installed in that wanting. There is only appetite. Now think about where that appetite went. It did not dissolve on its own. Appetite does not self-extinguish. It gets trained out. Someone told you not to ask for so much. Someone laughed at your big plans in a way that wasn't quite mean but landed somewhere close to it. Someone said money doesn't grow on trees, said people like us don't do things like that, said you're getting too big for your boots. Not maliciously. That's the thing. These were not attacks. They were transmissions. One adult passing a ceiling to another, the way you pass down a family recipe, automatically, tenderly, and with complete confidence that it's the right thing to give. Over time, you absorbed those transmissions. You filed them not as opinions but as facts. And facts, once filed, shape behavior without asking permission. What you call your relationship with money is not really a relationship. It is a set of inherited facts you have never examined closely enough to question. The good news, and this is the part that changes everything, is that inherited facts can be returned. You did not generate the scarcity, which means you are not responsible for maintaining it. A woman named Rosario grew up in a house where money was always late. Not absent, just consistently, anxiously late. The electric bill was always paid, but always at the last possible hour. The groceries came on Thursdays after payday, not before. She learned, without anyone telling her explicitly, that money was something that arrived only after maximum stress was applied. By the time she was 24 and running her own small catering business, she noticed something strange. Her business was doing well. She had clients. She had repeat bookings. But she found herself unable to act on opportunities until she felt a certain amount of pressure first. If a client called with an easy job, she hesitated. If the work came without friction, something in her stalled. One night after a long catering event, she sat in her car in the parking lot and just thought. She thought about the Thursday groceries. She thought about the lights that always stayed on, but only after her mother had made that particular worried face. And she understood for the first time that she had not been running a business. She had been reenacting a script. The moment she saw the script clearly, its grip softened, not disappeared, softened. That was enough. She stopped waiting for pressure to act. She called back the easy client. She took the frictionless job. Within 4 months, she had doubled her available bookings. The script had not been her truth. It had been her inheritance. The script had not been her truth. Let that land before moving forward. Here is the mechanism underneath that story, stated plainly. Your behaviors around money are almost never original. They are almost always performances of patterns you absorbed before you had the cognitive equipment to evaluate them. The 6-year-old who learned money comes only after stress had no neurological capacity to say, "Wait, let me examine whether this is universally true." Children do not have that filter. They absorb, they encode, they carry, which means almost every belief you hold about what you can have, what you are worth, and what people like you realistically expect from life, those beliefs arrived before you could consent to them. That is not a tragedy. It is a mechanical explanation for a mechanical problem. Remember the version of you waking up each morning in that chapter from 3 years ago. Not in terms of income or circumstances. Think about what you believed was possible for you back then. Think about the ceiling you were operating under. Now ask yourself whether you chose that ceiling or whether someone handed it to you and you never quite got around to returning it. That's the mirror moment. Sit with it honestly. Do not rush to the next thought. The frequency that produces wealth-building behavior is not a new skill. It is not a technique you learn from a seminar. It is the natural attunement of a person who has not been told yet that they should want less. Children operate from that frequency constantly. Their confidence is not performance. Their expectations are not arrogance. They simply have not yet been calibrated downward. Your work is not to become someone new. Your work is to reclaim the calibration that was yours before the adjustment. This brings us to Solomon. He came into this book 3 chapters ago as a man who was working harder than almost everyone he knew and still watching other people advance. He was not lazy. He was not stupid. He was precisely, efficiently tuned to the wrong frequency, the frequency of deficit psychology, which teaches that wanting is suspect, that confidence is presumption, and that the wise move is always to expect less so you won't be disappointed. He had absorbed that frequency so completely it felt like his own voice. He thought it was wisdom. He called it being realistic. What changed for Solomon was not a single revelation. It was a series of small recognitions, each one cracking the script a little more. He noticed that the most financially effective people he encountered did not seem to be trying harder than him. They seemed to be trying from a different position. They weren't straining toward wealth as if it were something foreign to them. They were operating as if their financial growth was already underway, already legitimate, already allowed. The labor was the same. The internal posture was different. Solomon stopped trying to want differently. He started asking a more useful question. He asked himself what he would do today if he already believed his growth was legitimate, not if he had more money, not if he had better connections. Just if he already believed the outcome was allowed, what would he actually do this afternoon? He answered the question. Then he did that thing. Then he asked the question again the next morning. Over 8 months, his income increased by 60%, not because he found a new strategy, because he stopped performing the old script and started recovering the original calibration. The removed lesson, the one quietly excised from the psychology of wealth and replaced with deficit frameworks that kept people productive but not prosperous, is not a complicated idea. It is almost embarrassingly simple. You are not broken. You were adjusted, and adjustments can be reversed. This is the point that deficit psychology could never afford to make. Because a person who knows their scarcity beliefs were installed is a person who no longer accepts them as permanent. That kind of person is harder to keep in a holding pattern. They start expecting more. They start asking different questions. They start acting from a different position, and the position changes the result. Later on, you will run into an idea about readiness, about when the right moment actually arrives. Once you grasp that turn, it reshapes how you decide to move that pushes directly against the usual belief. But right now, come back to the original question. If the frequency was always inside you, why does recovering it feel difficult? Here is the answer. It feels difficult because difficulty is part of the script. The script says growth should be hard, uncertain, probably out of reach for you specifically. So when you begin to recover your original calibration, the script generates resistance. It produces the feeling of difficulty as a defense mechanism. It wants you to interpret the resistance as evidence that you were right to doubt yourself. You were not right. The resistance is not evidence. It is noise from a program that no longer has your consent to run. The frequency is not out there. It is not in a course, a mentor, a lucky break, or a better set of circumstances. It is in you, underneath the accumulated weight of every calibration someone else performed on your expectations without your permission. The child who wanted without guilt, that child's attunement is still functional. It was never destroyed. It was buried. And buried things can be uncovered. The question is not whether the frequency exists inside you. It does. The question is how willing you are to stop performing the inherited script long enough to hear it. Chapter 12. You are now attuned, not aspirational. There is a pattern that lives at the center of every civilization that has ever risen and held. Across every era, in every language, among people who never shared a border or a common tongue, a small number of individuals moved differently through the same world as everyone else. Not because they were handed more. Not because luck visited them more often than it visited their neighbors. But because somewhere, at some point, they stopped wishing for a different life and started inhabiting one. That shift from wanting to being has no monument, no formal name, no classroom where it is taught. It is a quiet crossing. And every person who has ever made it describes the same thing on the other side. Not excitement, not relief, clarity. You are standing at that crossing right now. The frequency exists inside you. You heard that at the end of the last chapter, and you felt something when you heard it. The question left sitting in the air was whether you are willing to stop performing the inherited script long enough to hear it. That question is not rhetorical. This chapter answers it. Here is the open loop that will thread through everything that follows. There is a word that describes you now, at this exact point in this book, and it is not the word you have been using for yourself. Most people, when they describe their relationship to wealth, use words like working toward, or trying to build, or hoping to get there. Those words have a cost that almost no one notices. You are not working toward anything anymore. Look back at the life you were living 3 years ago and look at it plainly. Not just financially, but in how you thought about money. The story you told yourself about why it was hard, why others had more, why your own number never quite moved the way you imagined it would. Feel the weight of that version of yourself. Now feel where you are in this moment. You have come through 11 chapters that were not about tips or tactics. They were about the psychological wiring underneath every financial decision you will ever make. Something has changed. Not everything. But something real and measurable has changed in how you understand your own mind's relationship to wealth. That change has a name. The name is attunement. Attunement is not aspiration. Aspiration lives in the future. It is always pointing away from you, toward a version of your life that does not yet exist. Aspiration says, when I have that, I will feel this. Attunement says nothing at all. It simply is. A tuned instrument does not hope to produce the right note. It produces it because the conditions inside it match the conditions required. You are that instrument, and this chapter is the moment you stop calling yourself out of tune. There was a woman named Mara who worked in hospital administration for 9 years. She was competent, careful, and deeply committed to being financially responsible. She read every book that came recommended. She built a spreadsheet for her savings goals. She set reminders on her phone for budget reviews. And every month when she sat down with her numbers, she felt the same low-grade dread. As though money were a test, she was perpetually failing. One evening her colleague asked her, not unkindly, "Do you actually believe you're going to get where you're trying to go?" Mara said yes. Her voice did not say yes. Her colleague heard the hesitation and said something simple. "You're planning from fear. Planning from fear looks like effort, but it produces almost nothing." Mara sat with that for a long time. She did not change her spreadsheet. She changed the question she was asking herself before she opened it. The question she used to ask was, how far am I from where I need to be? The question she started asking was, what does a person who already manages money well do today? That one shift from measuring distance to inhabiting an identity changed everything about the decisions she made afterward. Not because the numbers were different, because she was. That is attunement. Notice what Mara did not do. She did not stop planning. She did not declare that money was already flowing and sit back and wait. She acted, but she acted from a different psychological address. That address is the difference between someone who is trying to become wealthy and someone who is already calibrated for it. Deficit psychology, the force that has worked against you across your entire financial education, trains you to see yourself as someone who lacks. It measures you by distance. It tells you that you must earn the identity only after the result appears. First the money, then the confidence. First the account balance, then the belief. That sequence sounds logical. It is exactly backward. Calibration always precedes arrival. Say that again to yourself, not with excitement, but with the quiet certainty of someone who now understands how frequency works. The radio tower does not wait for the signal to prove itself before aligning. It aligns and then the signal comes through. You are the tower. The signal is not the destination. It is the consequence of your alignment. The removed lesson, the one quietly and systematically excluded from every framework that was supposed to teach you how to thrive, was never about positive thinking. It was never about visualizing money. It was about this. Psychological address determines financial behavior, and financial behavior compounded over time produces every outcome. The lesson was removed because an educated, internally aligned population is far harder to sell anxiety to. Deficit psychology is a product. It has been packaged, marketed, and delivered inside institutions, inside families, inside the stories well-meaning people repeat to protect you from disappointment. But you have seen the architecture now. You cannot unsee it, which means the protection is gone. Not the dangerous kind where you were shielded from harm. The expensive kind where you were shielded from your own capacity. That version of protection is finished for you. Here is where the open loop closes. The word that describes you now, the word you were not using for yourself, is calibrated, not arrived. Not wealthy by every measure you once dreamed, but calibrated. pointed at the right frequency, operating from the right address, making decisions from the identity of someone for whom wealth is not a wish but a natural consequence of consistent internal alignment. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire distinction. The person who opened this book was aspiring, wanting, measuring distance from a destination that kept moving. The person finishing this chapter is something different, quieter, more grounded, more dangerous in the best possible sense to every old pattern that used to cost you without your noticing. You are not behind. You are calibrated, and calibration held steady always produces arrival. The only question left is the one the final chapter exists to answer. If calibration is your new address, what do you do with the lesson you have now fully restored? Chapter 13. You restored the lesson they removed. You have made it here, and that fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment. Most people do not make it here. Most people read the first chapter of something like this, feel a flicker of recognition, and then let the day swallow it whole. They tell themselves they will come back to it. They do not come back to it, but you came back. Chapter after chapter, you kept showing up for this. Somewhere in you, a part of you already knows something has changed. The question is not whether the change happened. The question is whether you are ready to name it, own it, and stop waiting for someone else to confirm that it is real. That is the edge you are standing on right now, not the edge of learning something new. The edge of accepting that you already know it, that you have rebuilt something piece by piece across these pages, that the curriculum they stripped away from you is no longer missing. You are the one who brought it back. Here is the open question to hold for now. If the lesson was removed, what does it mean to be the one who restores it? Sit with that. The answer is coming, but it needs the right foundation first. There is something the previous chapter left unresolved in the best possible way. It said that calibration is your new address. It asked what you do with the lesson you have now fully restored. That question was not rhetorical. It was an invitation. And this chapter exists to walk you all the way through the door. Think about where you were when this book first placed an idea in front of you. The idea that something specific had been removed from the psychology of success. Not removed by accident. Removed because desire, specifically the desire to build financial security, had been quietly reclassified as a character flaw rather than a human signal worth honoring. Deficit psychology did not announce itself. It crept into the curriculum, the culture, the casual comments of people who meant well and still taught you to feel guilty for wanting more. You absorbed it early. You carried it without knowing you were carrying it. And here is the cost nobody calculated for you. When you learn to treat your own economic instincts as suspect, you stop listening to them. You hesitate. You pause at the moment that requires motion. You second-guess the reading you got from the room, from the opportunity, from your own gut. A quiet background voice taught you that wanting things is the first sign that you cannot be trusted to evaluate them clearly. That voice was not wisdom. That voice was a curriculum, and it had an author. Yemi figured this out in a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon. That is not where you would expect a person to find clarity, but that is where it found her. She had been working as a purchasing coordinator for 6 years, watching contracts move through her hands that she had no stake in. She had the instincts of a buyer. She knew margins. She knew supplier relationships. She knew which products sat on shelves and which ones moved. What she did not know was how to stop treating that knowledge as something she was borrowing rather than something she owned. She had grown up in a house where talking about money meant someone was either in trouble or showing off. Neither was acceptable. So she kept her knowledge quiet and her ambitions quieter. One afternoon she was pricing fittings for a project, and the supplier she spoke with mentioned, almost in passing, that the small firm he used to use had folded. He was looking for someone local who understood inventory logic. She felt something register in her chest, a signal, and then, almost immediately, the old training activated. Who am I to do that? I do not have the capital. I have never run my own operation. What if I fail in front of everyone who is watching? She went home. She did not call the supplier back that day, but she wrote down on a folded receipt she found in her jacket pocket exactly what she had felt in that moment before the hesitation arrived. She wrote, "I knew this was for me before I talked myself out of it." She kept that receipt for 3 weeks. Then she called. The business she built from that call was not overnight. It was not dramatic, but it was hers. She told a friend later that the thing she had to overcome was not fear exactly. It was the trained suspicion that her own certainty was a warning sign rather than a compass. That is the lesson they removed. Not the tactics, not the formulas. The fundamental credibility of your own attunement. Here is the mirror moment this chapter is asking for. Think about the last time you felt something clearly. Felt a direction, felt a pull toward a specific decision that made economic sense, and then systematically argued yourself out of it. Not because the logic was wrong, because you did not trust the source of the logic, which was you. How many times has that happened? How much did that cost you? Not in one catastrophic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of doors you did not open. You do not have to count them all, but acknowledge that they existed. Because here is what has been happening across every chapter of this book, whether you registered it consciously or not. You have been re-establishing the credibility of your own signal. You have been learning to recognize attunement, not as mysticism, but as the trained capacity to read conditions, internal and external, and respond without the interference of guilt-loaded hesitation. That interference was never wisdom. It was a removal, and you have been restoring what was taken. The removed lesson is not a metaphor anymore. It is a specific thing. The psychological permission to treat your desire for financial stability, for economic participation, for the ability to build rather than just survive, as legitimate data, as a signal worth honoring rather than a symptom worth suppressing. Deficit psychology said that wanting more was the first sign of moral corruption. The lesson they removed said something entirely different. It said that attunement to opportunity is not greed. It is the natural function of a mind that has not been trained to distrust itself. You have that mind back now. And now the open question this chapter introduced can be answered fully. What does it mean to be the one who restores the lesson? It means you become the person in every room who does not flinch when desire shows up. You recognize it for what it is. A reading. A frequency. Not luck, not fate, not the exclusive property of people who were born into the right circumstances. A tunable signal that rewards the person willing to stop apologizing for receiving it. You do not go back to the old curriculum, not because you are above it, but because you have seen its cost in detail and you have built something more honest in its place. The frequency has always been there. You are the one who learned to stop blocking it. Now say this out loud if you are in a place where you can, or quietly in your own mind if not. Say, "What I know now I cannot unknow." Let that land, not as a motivational phrase, as a statement of fact about your own psychology. The rewiring has happened. The pattern is set. You are not the same person who opened this book. Returning to the old frequency would require more effort now than continuing forward. That is the reclamation. That is the restored lesson. And the only question the final chapter exists to answer is this. Now that you carry what was taken, what do you do with it next? Chapter 14. Tune in now and watch your world respond. Every culture that has ever built something lasting has carried a version of the same quiet knowledge. It was not written in their laws or their public texts. It moved through conversation, through apprenticeship, through private instruction passed from one person to the next when the crowd was not listening. The knowledge was always the same at its core. The inner life shapes the outer one, not occasionally, not poetically, but with a precision that most people are never taught to see. That knowledge gets buried. It gets buried by institutions that profit from confusion, by systems that need you to believe your circumstances are external and fixed. But it never disappears. And in every generation, some small number of people find it again and watch their world rearrange itself in response. You are one of those people. Not because you were born lucky, not because someone handed you an advantage, because you asked the right question and stayed long enough to hear the answer. That is where this chapter begins. And that is where your next chapter, the one that has no title yet because you are about to write it, begins too. There is one question left. You heard it at the close of the last chapter and it has been waiting here for you. Now that you carry what was taken, what do you do with it next? That question deserves more than inspiration. It deserves a precise answer. Think about where you were before you found this material. Not years ago necessarily, just before. Think about the feeling that pulled you towards something like this in the first place. There was probably a gap you could feel but could not name. A sense that other people had access to something you did not. That the rules were slightly different for them. That effort alone was not the full equation, but no one would tell you what the missing variable was. You were right. There was a missing variable, and the people who removed it from the formal curriculum did so not through malice alone, but through a deeper, quieter error. They confused wealth desire with moral failure. They built an entire framework of education around that confusion. They called it helping you be realistic. What they were actually doing was training you to associate building a better financial life with something to be ashamed of. That was the lesson they removed. The lesson was not greed. It was attunement. The recognition that the psychological state you hold before you act determines what actions become available to you and what results those actions produce. Not as metaphor, as mechanism. You have spent this entire book reconstructing that mechanism inside yourself. And now here is the thing about a mechanism once you understand it. You use it, not when circumstances improve, not when you feel ready in the way someone waiting for permission feels ready. You use it now, in the life you currently have, with the resources you currently hold, starting with the next decision that has any financial dimension at all. Here is a small story about how this works in practice. A woman named Celeste worked as an office administrator for 11 years at the same company. Not a bad job. Steady. But for the last 4 of those years, she had been watching colleagues get promoted past her. She watched their confidence in meetings. She noticed how differently they spoke about money and opportunity compared to how she had been taught to speak about those things. She thought the difference was their networks, their degrees, their ease. One Thursday afternoon, she sat in her car in the parking structure for 20 minutes before going inside. Not because she was afraid. Because she was paying attention to herself for the first time in a long time. She noticed that every morning she arrived already bracing, already waiting for a problem, already in a frequency that scanned for threat rather than opportunity. She did not quit her job. She did not take a course or start a side business that week. She changed one thing. She started arriving tuned to a different question. Instead of what do I need to defend today, she began asking what is available here that I have not looked at directly. The promotions came, not because of positive thinking, because she was suddenly seeing doors she had been facing away from for 4 years. That is attunement, specific, mechanical, available. Celeste's story closes the loop that has been running through every chapter of this book. The wealth frequency is not a mood you chase or a hack you apply. It is a perceptual orientation that determines which version of your actual environment you are living inside. Here is what that means for you right now. You do not need a new plan today. You need a new first step. One that proves to your own nervous system that the frequency is already operating. Pick one financial area of your life, one specific area, not a category, not a vague domain, and spend 5 minutes looking at it from the question of what is already here that I have not fully valued or activated. Not what is missing, what is present. That single reorientation is the frequency in practice. And the moment you do it with genuine attention, you will get a result. It may be small. It will be real. The pattern interrupts when you prove it to yourself rather than waiting for someone else to prove it for you. This is the initiation, not the inspiration. You have crossed from learning about the principle to holding it as part of who you are. There is a difference between a person who read about attunement and a person who is attuned. That difference used to live only in other people you observed from a distance and wondered about. It lives in you now, because you did the work of every chapter before this one. You sat with the uncomfortable recognition that deficit psychology had been installed in you without your consent. You felt the tension of realizing how long it had been operating quietly beneath your decisions. You held the hope that a different relationship with money and with building was possible. You received the revelation that the wealth frequency was never about luck, never about conditions, never about who your parents were or what school let you in. And now, here at the end, you feel the resolve, not as emotion, as identity. That is the final turn. The wealth frequency they removed from psychology class is not something you find one day and then lose when life gets complicated again. It is not a technique you remember to apply. It is something you become through the accumulating evidence of your own actions and their results. You have already begun the becoming. Every insight you absorbed, every moment you recognized yourself in these chapters, every small internal shift that happened when a sentence landed with unusual weight, that was not you learning. That was you remembering, recovering the original signal that was always yours, tuned in now and watching your world respond. The frequency was never luck. It was always you.